Hey everybody. In this lecture we're going to talk about how to approach Benjamin Franklin's autobiography as a reader, and also talk about some of the facts about how Franklin wrote and constructed the book, some facts about its publication, and also a really interesting question about where did Franklin get the idea of writing an autobiography. This book's different than all the others that we're going to be reading in this class. It's an autobiography. It's not a textbook. It's not a history monograph. And so knowing some things about its writing and construction and the actual history of the book can be helpful in terms of understanding what Franklin was doing. Okay. So the first thing we're going to think about is why we're reading this book. I talked about this a little bit in the last lecture, and we'll talk about it again here. As I told you, Franklin never mentions the word enlightenment, nor will he have any sort of extended discussions on those elements of enlightenment thought that we discussed in the last two lectures. He's not gonna, talk about reason and secularism and the idea of progress. However, Franklin's life embodies the spirit of a lot of these elements of Enlightenment thought. I could have given you a book specifically about the American Enlightenment. There's plenty of these that exist. But some of them, frankly, just had too many pages. Some of them are too advanced for a 200 level class. Some of them would be fairly boring for most of you. So instead I have us read Franklin's autobiography because it's more interesting and I can get to all the points and all the facets of the Enlightenment through the life of Benjamin Franklin, which makes it, I think, more interesting, but also a bit more accessible for you guys because although it's an old book, it's not a super difficult book to read for a university class. All right? And so that's why we're reading it. Franklin gets to all the important stuff in the Enlightenment I certainly want to talk about. Let's talk about why other people have read the book. When you look at the history of books Americans have read, Franklin's autobiography would rank very high on that list. Generation after generation after generation of Americans have read Franklin's autobiography for the insights it offers into the life of a very interesting and extraordinary man, for insights into American history and the colonial period and the creation of the nation and the early republic. But people have also read Franklin's autobiography because it is one of the founding texts in a particular genre of American literature, the self-made man story, the story of the person coming from modest means to achieve extraordinary things. Franklin is the American success story personified. All right? And that's why people have, another reason why people have turned to Franklin's autobiography. As I'm going to talk about in a little while, you can almost think of the book as a self-help book for those people that wanted to become famous, rich, successful, and happy. All right. Franklin offers a lot of advice to his readers in terms of how you should live your life, and a lot of readers have found that appealing. For this course specifically, like I said before, the reason we're reading it is for insight into the Enlightenment, but people have read it for a lot of different reasons. We're going to talk about how Franklin wrote the autobiography, but before we get to that, let's contemplate where he might have got the idea to write an autobiography. If you think about it, we don't have anything like Franklin's autobiography from any of the other founding fathers. Not from Washington, not from Adams, Jefferson, Madison. Hamilton died young, so it would have been tough for him. But none of them wrote autobiographies, which might seem surprising to a lot of you, because we live in an age where just about any powerful, successful, or famous person tends to write an autobiography about their life. It's a really popular genre of reading for people. But in the 17th century, it was a relatively rare form of writing. You just didn't see that much of it. And so what's intriguing, what's interesting isn't so much why didn't other founding fathers write autobiographies. They didn't do it because it wasn't that common at the time. What's intriguing is, well, why did Franklin? What's going on there? Well, some people have speculated that the reason Franklin wrote, he never called it an autobiography. He always called it his memoir. Where Franklin got this idea of writing his memoir might have had a lot to do with our old friends, the Puritans. See, Benjamin Franklin was born in 1706 in Boston, Massachusetts. Miles away, just miles away from the village of Denham. During that 100-year history we've just been talking about in our Puritan unit. And during this time, during the 1700s, books were really expensive and hard to get a hold of if you didn't have money. There were no free lending libraries where you could just walk into a building and take a book and tell them, hey, I'll bring it back in 2 weeks. Those didn't exist. Franklin would create the first one of those in Philadelphia, the city he's going to move to when he leaves Boston. But for somebody like Benjamin Franklin, who from an early age, and we'll talk about this, was a voracious reader, loved to read. But he didn't grow up rich. He came from kind of a middling family. And so getting access to reading material could be something of a challenge. By the way, this is one of the reasons why back in the day people read the Bible so much. It wasn't simply because of religious devotion. It was sometimes because that was a book that was readily available. So people read it again and again and again. Bible's full of interesting stories of warfare and adultery and betrayal and monsters. I mean, all kinds of stuff in that book. And so this is one of the reasons why people back in the day knew the Bible so well beyond just religious belief. It's like, what else are you going to do? Sit in a room and stare at a wall? Well, you can read this book. Well, one of the types of books that was prevalent in Boston are what we could describe as spiritual autobiographies. Remember our discussion of the stages of conversion that the Puritans believed they went through if they were visible saints? Well, often they would write about this experience. They would write about their life before receiving God's conversion, that build up, that feeling of change, the exact moment when they felt their sins were forgiven, how their life changed and they became better people afterwards. There was a strong tradition of autobiographical writing about your religious conversion with the Puritans. And some people have speculated the young Benjamin Franklin, that was such a voracious reader, must have read a bunch of these spiritual autobiographies. And some speculate this might have been what sparked in his head the idea of, oh, I'll write my own autobiography. I'll write my own memoir. However, the difference between the spiritual nature of these Puritan autobiographies and Benjamin Franklin's autobiography is really interesting and really revealing. See, the Puritans were very much focused on, as we all know now, about pleasing God and doing what God wants and focusing on what life will be like once we die. Franklin wasn't terribly interested in a lot of these issues. We're going to talk about the evolution of Franklin's religious views. But Franklin was very interested in this world, the here and now. How you get to heaven, how you avoid hell, Franklin just wasn't very concerned about that at all. At the very least, he doesn't deal with it in the autobiography. His autobiography is about the here and now, this world. And so what's interesting about this idea that Franklin might have based his autobiography on the idea of spiritual autobiographies is that the lack of spiritual nature to Franklin's autobiography. But there is a parallel. One way to think of the spiritual autobiography is almost like a self-help book. This is why the Puritans wrote about this experience, for others to read about it. The spiritual autobiography tends to have a similar narrative structure. It's, I was a low-down, dirty, rotten sinner. The Lord came into my life. Everything got better. You should be a Christian too. Or a slight variation on that. I started out in a Christian family. I backslid, became a dirty, low-down, rotten sinner. The Lord came into my life. Everything got better. You should be a Christian too. In a certain way, you could think of the spiritual autobiography almost as a self-help book, a way to encourage bringing people to the Lord and making their lives better. Franklin's book, and I'll talk more about this throughout our unit on Franklin. Franklin's book also was very much a kind of self-help book. Franklin came from a modest background and goes on to achieve extraordinary things: fame, success, wealth, political power. And in the autobiography, Franklin describes a lot of this and explains how this happened. And Franklin himself, as we'll see in our next lecture, very much thought in terms of his memoir as being a matter of something to help people, as a self-help book. If you find yourself, reader, in similar situations to me, Benjamin Franklin, try to do some of these things I lay out. But Franklin's advice is all about this world, the here and now. You interested in how to get into heaven? How to avoid hell? He's got virtually nothing to tell you about that. You want to be successful in this world? You want to make some money in this world? You want to be happy in this world? He's got all kinds of advice on that. So it's intriguing that Franklin might have based his idea for writing the autobiography based on his earlier reading of spiritual autobiographies. But when he sat down to write his autobiography, it's almost as if he bled all of the religious components that might have been there out of it. Don't get me wrong, he talks about religion, he talks about his evolution in terms of religious belief. But in no way does he seem to be strongly encouraging us to think about religion in a particular way, which would have been very different from the spiritual autobiographies. So why he might have wrote this is really interesting, and it touches upon something that we talked a lot about, and so I find that interesting. Let's talk about how Franklin wrote the autobiography now. With just about any version of the autobiography you find in book version, it will be broken into 4 parts. Why is it broken into 4 parts? Because Franklin wrote his memoir, his autobiography, at 4 distinct periods of his life. He would just start writing it. He would get done with what he thought he needed to write about, and he would take years off. at one point more than a dozen years before he starts again. And then later on, it would occur to him and he would start writing about his life again, and then he would stop and wait a few years and start again. He did that 4 times in his life. Franklin never published his memoir, his autobiography. He printed up copies of it. He was a printer. He gave copies of it to friends and family. And something that would surprise him after the first part he wrote and started printing up copies and giving it to people, other people started printing up copies of it. And so it got out and people read it, but he never formally published it. In fact, it wasn't until after Franklin's death in 1790 that the 4 parts were compiled, put together, and sold to the public. So let's talk about each one of these periods of his writing, because there's some interesting things about this. Part 1. Franklin wrote in 1771. He was 65 years old. In 1771, Franklin was a trade representative for the colony of Pennsylvania in England. He was there to facilitate trade between England and Pennsylvania. That was his position. He had a week's vacation, and he decided to write about his early life. And part 1 covers his family history up through his early childhood and his life into the early 20s. Later on, I'll talk about why it's interesting where Franklin stops writing part 1. It's kind of revealing why he decided to stop there. There's a reason for it. And then Franklin just left this alone. It wasn't for another 13 years before he started writing again. In 1784, now Franklin was a trade representative in France, but now he was a trade representative no longer for the colony of Pennsylvania, but rather the newly created United States of America. And he was a trade representative trying to facilitate trade between the new country and France. Franklin was 78 years old now, and he decided to pick up the writing. In almost every copy version of the autobiography, part 2 begins with 2 letters. A letter from a man, Abel James, and a letter from a man named Benjamin Vaughan. And both of these men, who didn't know each other, independent of each other, around the same time wrote Franklin a letter saying, hey, we read part 1 of your memoir. It stops in your early 20s. You're an old man. Write about the rest of it. There's so much other interesting stuff later in your life. Please start writing about it again. And it appears that this is the thing that encouraged Franklin to start writing again. One of the things that's interesting is Franklin didn't have a copy of the autobiography part 1 with him when he sat down to write part 2. And so he actually winds up repeating some of the stuff at the beginning of part 1, or the beginning of part 2, that he already talked about at the end of part 1. For example, at the beginning of part 2, he talks about this club he created, the Junto, as if we'd never heard about it before. Like he was introducing us to the idea of this club. But we actually just read about it at the end of part 1. He talked about it at the end of part 1, but in the 13-year period between when he finished part 1 and started writing part 2, he just forgot that he'd already told us about it. Right? Part 3, Franklin writes in 1787. 1787 is a very important year in American history. The first constitution that the Americans created, known as the Articles of Confederation, did not work very well. It was too weak a form of government, didn't provide enough central authority to a federal government. So in 1787 and 1788, some of those old revolutionary founding fathers got together again in Benjamin Franklin's adopted city of Philadelphia to craft a new constitution. And when I'm reading part 3 of the autobiography, I sometimes get distracted because, being the history nerd that I am, I sort of nerd out on the fact that as I'm reading part 3, it keeps occurring to me that, wow, at the same time Franklin was writing this, he was also helping write the Constitution of the United States. I know, I'm a nerd. And then Franklin writes part 4 in 1790 on his deathbed. Franklin would die in 1790. He was sick and dying, and he knew he was dying. And so he was trying to finish up as much of his life story as he could before he passed away at the end. So there's no thematic reason why the autobiography is broken up into 4 different parts. It's just at 4 different times in his life, he wrote about himself. And so that's why there's 4 parts in the autobiography. How Franklin justifies writing about himself. He talks about this in the first few paragraphs of the autobiography. In our next lecture, I'm going to have a kind of a close reading of a few paragraphs, the first few paragraphs of the autobiography, in which we will deal with this subject. Because what those first paragraphs are about is Franklin explaining to us why he's writing his memoir, why he's writing his autobiography. And so we'll end this one here. This slide will pertain to what I'm talking about next time. But I'll have the text on the screen for you, and we'll go over the first few paragraphs. And at the beginning of the lecture, I'll explain to you why I'm going into such depth in those first few paragraphs. But that's good enough for now. You guys take care. I'll see you next time. Bye.